So now we're going to turn to our next mother of modern dance that we're looking at, which is Ruth St. Denis. Ruth St. Denis was seen as one of the first to merge vaudeville in dance, other than ballet, and to present it as art. She was alive and working between 1879 and 1968, so around the same time as Isadora Duncan, actually. She is known for having introduced Eastern elements into U.S. stage dance choreography, particularly Indian Nautch dance and other Oriental dance forms. She's also known for founding the Dennis Shawn School of Dance, which she founded with her husband at the time, Ted Shawn, another major contributor to early modern dance. And that school, which was based in California, in Los Angeles, was a place that many later modern dance choreographers first trained, including Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey. And it was a school where they were working with a number of dance forms from Asia and other parts of the world, teaching those. She's important in dance history for the philosophy of dance that she embodied more than for creating a movement vocabulary or a technique or movement technique. It's more the philosophy that she brought to dance that's been seen as influential rather than a creation of a particular movement technique, as with some of the other choreographers we'll look at. So her philosophy, similar to Duncan's, was that dance is sacred. For St. Denis, dance was a spiritual expression, a way to connect with the one, the wholeness, the universal truth. She also had interests in transcendentalism, and for her, particularly also in Christian Science, which included ideas about the spiritual nature of reality. A quote from her is, "I see the dance being used as a means of communication between soul and soul to express what is too deep, too fine for words." So she also wrote how to dance is to feel oneself actually a part of the cosmic world, rooted in the inner reality of spiritual being. One of her most famous works is called Radha. It's from 1906, and the picture that you see here is a picture from it. She made this piece from her studies in Hindu and Buddhist literature. The quote that you have in front of you talks about how her studies in Hindu and Buddhist literature gave rise to Radha, which she says, "I felt at the same time to be a first gesture towards the use of the dance as a means of spiritual expression." So again, she's interested in this idea of dance as an expression of spirituality, and whereas Duncan was turning to Greek ideals and to the idea of the natural, she's turning to Eastern dance and Christian Science in this idea of dance as having a spiritual aspect to make her contribution. She is seen as, in dance history and dance studies, as the great symbol of the mystical strand in American life, the strand that wanders through generation after generation of an interest in the mystic. That's from dance studies scholar Christina Schlund. So as the videos that you watched noted, there's a famous story about Ruth St. Denis and how she was inspired to do this work, drawing on Eastern choreography and cultures, after she saw an Egyptian cigarette poster. So as it says in the article that you read from the International Encyclopedia of Dance, during a Belasco tour in 1904, she spied in a drugstore window in Buffalo, New York, a poster advertising Egyptian deities' cigarettes. Gazing at the poster with its depiction of the goddess Isis, meditating on the virtues of Turkish cigarettes, St. Denis suddenly envisioned an artistic form for her spiritual quest. So she turned to the Eastern images, Egyptian, Indian dance and ideas as a way of expressing her spiritual quest. Another scholar writes, "The cigarette poster was but a catalyst in a long, simmering process, a trail of discovery," and then describes how, looking for information on India, Ruthie, which is one of the ways that St. Denis was referred to, Ruthie went to the Astor Library where she researched her ideas. So the story is, she saw this poster, she was inspired by it, and she went to the library to look up more information. And that's how she made her dances. So at the time that she's working, there's a vogue. What's it? Vogue in artistic society is this interest in exoticism, a popularization of the exotic in cultural forms, particularly in a popular and elite fascination with non-European cultures. So think about this is the time, this is being influenced, as I've said, by transcendentalism, American philosophy, and Eastern influences on American philosophy. It's also being influenced by World's Fairs that are circulating around this time, the Chicago World's Fair happening around the turn of the century. And we talked about this a bit in the Hula unit, the way that different cultures from around the world were being brought to the U.S. and put on display at these fairs. So there's a larger cultural interest in exotic others and circulations of them happening in American culture. St. Denis was a very shrewd businesswoman and showed a sense of the value of a search for novelty in her dance making also. She was, said, oh, there's a lot of, I can imagine her seeing this interest in the exotic and kind of capitalizing on it to create her own career at the time. So again, keep in mind that when all of this is going on, it's also a time of massive colonial expansion by the U.S. Hawaii and the Philippines were both annexed in 1898, as again we talked about in the Hula unit. So there's a lot of colonization of American colonization going out into the Pacific and annexing places. That's happening at the same time that this fascination with the exotic is circulating in American culture. And here's some pictures that of Ruth St. Denis, so you can note the different costumes that she's wearing, the different kinds of attire, parts of her body that are being shown, her belly, her bare legs, and the different Eastern cultures that she is putting on and embodying in her dancing. Scholars have connected her interest in the exotic dance and exotic dance forms to Orientalism. And Orientalism is defined as the way that the West defines itself in relation and particularly in contrast to an imagined exotic East. So the term Orientalism refers to his political relations between West and East, whatever those terms mean. That's a whole other complication. But it also refers to the discovery and study of various Oriental cultures by Westerners and to a body of assumptions, images, and fantasies held by Westerners about the Orient. So Orientalism is seen as a way that Westerners have thought about the East. In other words, seeing that poster of an Egyptian, of Isis, was more about Ruth St. Denis's ideas about Egypt than it was about Egypt. So Orientalism is a way of looking at people's ideas about the East as reflecting on them, not about what they're looking at. So this line of argument sees Ruth St. Denis's Eastern self-staging in these dances as embodying Orientalist ideas and fantasies, and sees it as linked to the political imperialism of the day. And again, as with Duncan, this is the same period as Duncan, and the period, as I mentioned, of changing attitudes towards women's bodies. That's also a part of the context that St. Denis is working in. She also had bare feet, wore revealing costumes, used movement styles that were associated with erotic and sexual meanings. And she also linked the sexual with the exalted. She linked dance with the exalted, I should say. So in a way, her connection with the divine of Hindu goddesses and Egyptian goddesses, I should say, took away some of the scandal of women dancing publicly. Again, she turned not to Greece and the natural, but to Eastern religions to desexualize herself. So for her, whereas Duncan turned to the natural and to Greece as a way of presenting herself in her dance as art rather than as sexually alluring, what St. Denis did was to invoke spirituality in Eastern dance and to make the dance religious and morally pure because of its association with Eastern spirituality rather than seen as sexual. So again, keep in mind that at the time that St. Denis is doing this work, women choreographers were rare. To have a woman who is who is seen as the artistic innovator and who's doing this work was quite radical for the time. These discourses of morality enabled her to subvert contemporary standards for respectable women's display of their own bodies or sexuality. Scholar and UCR dance professor Linda Tomko writes how, quote, Ruth St. Denis labored hard to displace the demeaned and demeaning status allocated to professional dancers and strove to produce other meanings for women's dancing, to escape the equation of things corporeal with the sexual and only the sexual. So she was doing a lot of work, again, to disassociate dance from the sexual for women at the time, and that was in the context of women's rights that were going on, that were developing then at the time also. And Tomko also writes a lot about how St. Denis was supported by female patrons in women's clubs. So a lot of society of women who came to support her and to promote her and to present them in their salons, which conferred a legitimacy on her dance form, and which was seen as a new and serious kind of dance drama that she was introducing. Again, rather, it was respectable. It was circulating in these upper class women's salons and drawing rooms, and part of a whole culture of women's support for one another at the time. So another argument for looking at Ruth St. Denis's dance project looks at its racial politics. This argument goes something like, dancing as an Indian woman allowed St. Denis to be sexy on stage in public, which chaste women of the day couldn't be. I mean, good, women who were seen as respectable and of a certain class weren't able to go onto a stage and dance in public, certainly not with a bare midriff, and do so in a way that was seen as respectable in art. So her doing it as an Indian woman allowed her to do this. So how did this work? Well, first, since darker women were seen as erotic, as we also looked at earlier in the hula unit, St. Denis's portrayal of a woman of color had the effect of sexualizing her in the audience's mind. But since she wasn't really a woman of color, but a white woman, it was seen as okay. In other words, by playing at being Indian and inhabiting darker bodies and positions while actually still being white, she could both perform as sexy but not be seen as sexually dangerous. Another way of analyzing and thinking about St. Denis's project was to think about how to recognize the labor that went into her artistic production, or went into the artistic production of the choreographies that she presented. So the story goes, as I've recapped for you a bit earlier, that St. Denis learned Indian dances from the library and was inspired by a poster of Egypt that she saw while traveling in New York. But scholar and UC Riverside dance professor Priya Srinivasan has traced how St. Denis didn't actually learn Indian dancing just from the library after being inspired by a poster, but rather from Indian women nautch dancers in Coney Island, New York in 1904. Srinivasan argues that you can read the history of her relationship to these women who were teaching her, or from whom she was learning the dances that she represented, in her own dancing, that her hand precisely forming the mudra and her bodily movements lifting her skirts in spiral turns are proof, or show us today, that she actually was learning this not just from a library book and not just from a poster in her own imagination, that she was learning it from people who were working with her and teaching her. Srinivasan writes, even though modern and postmodern dance historians fail to remember the nautch women whose labor prompted St. Denis's creation of Radha, the first elaborate piece she premiered after seeing the exhibitions in the Coney Island Spectacle, St. Denis's white female body and performance highlights and testifies to their kinesthetic legacy. Kinesthetic legacy would be the history, the legacy that's held in her body and the way it moves. If you look at the way her body is moving, you can actually see the influence and the contributions and the labor of these other dancers who aren't and haven't been credited by her or by dance historians until recently. Srinivasan also writes about how St. Denis learned from Indian men that she gathered together to learn from and that she included in the background of her performances, and how she didn't credit them in their contributions. She didn't credit them for their contributions to her choreography, which again she presented as her choreography rather than something that she learned from others. And in fact, in 1910, Srinivasan writes about how one of these men attempted to sue her on the grounds that he had invented her dances. Unsuccessfully, I should say. You can read about it in the writing in the bibliography. And to keep in mind, as Srinivasan notes, that this is a period that where anti-immigration laws directed towards Asians in particular were circulating in American culture. Srinivasan argues that far from being a benign discourse where Ruth St. Denis was just, oh, I'm going to draw from what I see and take it and present it as my own, she was actually working in the context in which of North American Orientalism. And she writes, far from being a benign discourse, North American Orientalism manifested in a violent, racialized economy that enabled a white woman such as St. Denis to perform Indian dances of sorts without opposition or question. And she describes how, from 1907 to 1917, there were growing restrictions on Asian immigration and increasingly hostile environments for Asian immigrants. How in 1917, immigration laws barred Asians from immigrating to the U.S. How in 1924, Asians were denaturalized and deprived of citizenship. So all of that is part of the political history that's going on around the time that St. Denis is developing these Orientalist dances, which she presents as her own choreography and which have been read as by dance historians as the product of, an individual genius mother of modern dance rather than seen as part of a collaborative effort. So we're back to the questions that we've dealt with throughout this course about appropriation and commodification, questions about who's making money off of whose labor, who's getting credit, who's being invisibilized, so ideas of economic profit as well as cultural capital. As Srinivasan writes, in the tradition of Orientalism, St. Denis's performances became perceived as the creative imaginings of a white bourgeois American woman. So both of these, a couple of the scholars I've presented, whose ideas I've presented to you today, talk about ways that recent scholarship has seen St. Denis's contributions not as solely the product of an individual. Linda Tomko writes, far from being singular geniuses, dancers like St. Denis generated themselves and their artistic dance practices by weaving back and forth between commercial institutions and the networks and relationships provided by women's cultural practices. So Tomko is arguing that Duncan was producing her work not as all by herself in some vacuum, but as part of a whole network of women supporting each other at this era. And Srinivasan writes about how through St. Denis, she argues that the inception of modern dance in America was a collective endeavor, that it drew on the labor not just of individual women, seen as I said, the mothers of modern dance, but the contributions of a number of people working to create this choreography and contributing to it.